Alexander was an ordinary city dweller. He lived in Moscow, worked in an office, spent his evenings at the gym and bars, and socialized with friends on weekends. Everything in his life was going smoothly, but sometimes he felt like something was missing. It was as if something important, something deep, connected to his roots, was hidden behind the walls of concrete high-rises. This spring, he decided he needed a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. His friends talked about various vacation spots, resorts, overseas trips, tours of Europe. But Alexander felt he needed something else: peace, silence, nature. He remembered the house he had inherited from his grandfather. It stood in a remote forest, not far from the small village where he had spent his childhood. Alexander hadn't been there in a long time and decided it was time to return. The house stood on the edge of the forest, surrounded by ancient pines and firs. The journey there was long, first by train to the nearest town, then by bus to the village, and from there a walk of about an hour along a forest path. But Alexander was determined and even looked forward to the upcoming days of solitude. Arriving in the village, Alexander noticed that little had changed. The rural houses, creaking shutters, and elderly people on benches all seemed unchanged, as if not a single day had passed in recent years. He bought some provisions in the only store and headed towards the forest. The forest greeted him with the quiet rustling of leaves and the scent of pine. Alexander walked along the path, enjoying the sounds of nature. After half an hour, he saw the old house standing among the trees. It looked just as he remembered it from his childhood, only now it seemed more neglected. The windows were missing glass, the door was slightly askew, and thick bushes grew around the porch. Alexander opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of dampness and old wood filled his nostrils. He felt a slight unease, but quickly dismissed it. "It's just a house, just a little older," he thought. Inside, everything remained in its place: old armchairs, a wooden table, a fireplace that his grandfather always kept warm. Alexander unpacked his things and decided to inspect the house. In one of the rooms, he found an old lamp, lit it, and noticed many strange symbols on the walls that he had never seen before. They were scratched with a sharp object, and something disturbing emanated from them. But he tried not to pay attention, attributing it to local teenagers playing pranks. In the evening, Alexander lit a fire in the fireplace, cooked dinner, and sat down to eat. The house was quiet. Only the crackling of logs broke the silence. Suddenly, he thought he heard some noises outside the window, as if someone or something was making its way through the bushes. He got up, went to the window, and looked outside. But there was only the dark forest around, and he saw nothing suspicious. That night, he had strange dreams. It seemed to him that he was walking through the forest, but the forest was not as usual. The trees seemed to reach out to him. Branches creaked and whispered something incomprehensible. He felt that someone was watching him, but he couldn't understand who. At some point, he turned around and saw a silhouette standing among the trees, but he didn't have time to make out who it was before he woke up. The awakening was sudden and unexpected. Alexander opened his eyes and saw that the room was completely dark, the fire in the fireplace long gone out. He listened to the silence and suddenly heard strange sounds, as if someone was walking around the house. The steps were quiet but distinct, as if someone was cautiously moving across the creaky floorboards. His heart began to beat faster, but Alexander tried to calm himself. "Maybe it's rats or some forest animals that got inside," he told himself, although an inner voice insisted that something was not right. The next day, Alexander decided to inspect the house more carefully. He knew that his grandfather stored many old things, tools, and supplies in the basement, and thought he might find something useful for repairs. However, when he descended into the basement, he noticed that there were many more things than he remembered. The shelves were lined with old books, candles, and tools, many of which seemed ancient. On one of the tables, he noticed strange items, wooden figurines, ritual knives, and totems. These things weren't ordinary. They resembled ritualistic objects. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. While inspecting the items, he came across an old journal. His grandfather had never mentioned keeping any records, and this piqued Alexander's interest. He opened the journal and began to read. The entries started with ordinary notes about life in the village, but the further he read, the stranger things became. His grandfather described encounters with locals who told him about strange events in the forest, disappearances, mysterious lights at night, and heard screams. But then it got even worse. His grandfather wrote that he himself began to notice oddities. He heard whispers, saw shadows among the trees, and even felt that someone was watching him. In one of the entries, he mentioned strange dreams in which he saw ghostly figures calling him deeper into the forest. The journal ended abruptly, with no explanations. Alexander closed the journal with a heavy feeling. He realized that something was wrong in the house, but instead of leaving, he decided to stay, trying to understand what had happened to his grandfather and why he had suddenly stopped writing in his journal. That night, the dreams returned. Once again, Alexander found himself in that same forest where the trees seemed alive. He walked along the path, feeling the shadows around him thickening. This time, he knew he had to find the place where he was being called, but he feared what he might discover there. Suddenly, an old wooden cabin appeared in front of him, one he didn't know about. It stood in dense thickets, as if hidden from prying eyes. Quiet voices came from inside, and Alexander approached. He peeked inside and saw a group of people sitting around a fire. They were speaking in an unknown language, and in the center of the circle lay something wrapped in cloth. He wanted to run away, but his legs seemed rooted to the ground. One of the people suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at him. His eyes were empty, as if there was no soul, no reason in them. At that moment, Alexander woke up, drenched in cold sweat. He quickly realized he wasn't alone. Something was moving in the darkness of the room. Alexander felt rising terror but couldn't move. Suddenly, the lamp on the table lit up by itself, and in its dim light he saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a tall man in old-fashioned clothes, his face hidden in shadow. Alexander couldn't make out the features but felt a heavy gaze on him. The figure took a step forward, and Alexander heard a whisper, like a distant echo. "You shouldn't have returned." Then everything plunged into darkness and he lost consciousness again. Waking up in the morning, Alexander realized that it was not just a dream. He had indeed seen something during the night, and that something had warned him. But what could it mean? And why did he not want to leave despite the horror he had experienced? He remembered that his grandfather's journal mentioned something about the forest and strange occurrences. But as he flipped through the pages, his heart sank as he reached the end. Dusk was settling in as Alexei stopped his car on a dirt road leading to the old Dark Grove camp. The camp had been abandoned for many years, and only the occasional tourist or thrill-seeker dared to visit. The camp became infamous in the mid-'80s when tragedy struck. A counselor hanged himself from a tree near the main building. Since then, according to legends, his spirit had haunted the camp, scaring away any who ventured near. Alexei wasn't one to believe in ghosts. He was a journalist specializing in urban legends and mysterious stories. Dark Grove promised to be great material for his next article. He grabbed his flashlight, camera, and notebook and headed towards the camp's crumbling gates. The camp greeted him with dead silence. Over the years of neglect, nature had reclaimed the area. The building was overgrown with ivy, and the paths where children once ran were now covered in tall grass. Alexei walked through the rusted gates and headed toward the central building that loomed in the distance. He was curious about what exactly happened to that counselor. The story told of a young man named Igor. a quiet and reserved person. He was rarely seen with any of his colleagues, and the children avoided him, thinking him strange. One day, he was found hanging from a tree near the main building. It was said that he left a note before his death, but its contents were never revealed. Alexei reached the main building and paused. Before him stood an old two-story structure, its windows shattered long ago and its doors hanging askew. Inside, it was dark and damp. The smell of mold and decay filled the air. He switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The spacious lobby, with cracked floors and peeling plaster, looked eerie. Faded Soviet-era posters still clung to the walls. Alexei walked further in, inspecting the place, when he noticed something strange. On the wall opposite an old, dusty mirror, there was a fresh scratch, as if someone had recently run a sharp object across it. It struck him as odd, but he figured it might have been left by a recent visitor. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind him. Alexei turned around, aiming his flashlight at the source of the noise, but saw nothing. Only the shadows of old columns danced on the walls. He reassured himself, thinking it was just rats, and continued his exploration. Climbing to the second floor, Alexei saw a long corridor lined with doors on either side. Behind each one had once been rooms for the campers. Now they were empty spaces with collapsed ceilings and cracked walls. Alexei opened one of the doors and peeked inside. Nothing of note, just dust and broken furniture. But in one room he saw something unusual. In the center of the room lay an old doll. Its face was disfigured, eyes gouged out, and its mouth appeared to have been torn. A cold shiver ran down Alexei's spine, but he chalked it up to a draft blowing through the ruins. He picked up the doll and saw that someone had carved a word into its body: help. Alexei dropped the doll and quickly left the room. He didn't like this place, but he still didn't believe in ghosts and decided to continue his investigation. As he walked further down the corridor, Alexei noticed fresh, muddy footprints on the floor. They led to one of the rooms at the end of the hall. His heart began to race. He approached the door, behind which he could see a faint light, as if someone was inside. Alexei hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped in. The room was empty. Only a small candle flickered on a table, illuminating an old diary. The initials IG were written on the cover. Alexei cautiously opened the diary and began to read. It was Igor's diary, the counselor who had hanged himself. The pages were filled with different handwriting styles, as if the person writing had been losing his mind. It described his time working at the camp and how he gradually began to feel that something was wrong. He heard voices and saw strange shadows. No one believed him, and Igor felt he was going insane. He described how, every night, a terrifying man with black eyes would visit him, whispering horrible things in his ear and forcing him to do things he didn't want to do. On the last page was a note: "He will take me. Goodbye." A chill ran down Alexei's spine. He didn't know whether to believe these writings, but everything felt disturbingly real. Suddenly the candle began to flicker, and the room grew darker. Alexei sensed someone behind him. He slowly turned around, but no one was there. Only the mirror on the opposite wall reflected his tense face. But then Alexei noticed that his reflection was smiling. A wide, insane grin twisted its features, even though he hadn't moved. Alexei jumped back, but stumbled and fell to the floor. The reflection in the mirror let out a quiet, hollow laugh, and Alexei knew it was time to leave. He got up and, without looking back, ran out of the room. The House of Wax Figures. Andrei stood on a deserted road, illuminated by the dim light of the moon. Around him lay a village that seemed abandoned. Nearby, he noticed a house that looked old and neglected, as if it had stood there for centuries. Its roof was covered in moss, the windows were dusty, and the fence barely held together on its posts. The house drew him in as if by some magical force, despite the growing unease in his chest. Something about this place seemed wrong, but curiosity, mixed with an unrecognized fear, urged Andre to take a step forward. There wasn't a soul in sight, only the faint rustling of the wind and the sounds of the night coming from the depths of the forest. Andre approached the house, and as soon as he touched the door handle, a chill ran down his spine. The door opened easily, as if someone had been waiting for his arrival. Inside, the house was much larger than it appeared, with long corridors leading into dark depths. Old paintings hung on the walls, depicting grim scenes. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, and something ancient and sinister emanated from them. The air was thick with the smell of wax, heavy and dense, as if everything around was saturated with it. Andre slowly walked forward, feeling the tension in his chest grow with each step. Soon he entered a large hall, and his gaze fell upon the figures standing in the center of the room. These were wax figures, crafted with astonishing detail. They depicted various people, men, women, and children. All of them were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and their faces expressed deep sorrow or horror. The figures looked so real that for a moment, Andre thought they were living people. He moved closer and examined one of them carefully. It was a middle-aged man with deep wrinkles on his forehead and eyes full of pain. His hand was stretched out as if trying to hold on to something or stop something. At that moment, Andre felt something move behind him. He quickly turned around, but there was only darkness. His heart began to beat faster, and he involuntarily took a step back. Something was wrong with this place. The wax figures seemed too realistic, too lifelike. Andre looked around once more. The room was dimly lit by the weak light filtering through the dusty windows. It seemed that the shadows around him began to move, growing thicker. He decided to leave, but something held him in place. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper echoing through the room. The sound was so quiet that it could have been mistaken for his imagination. But the whisper grew louder and clearer. The words were unintelligible, as if someone was speaking in an ancient, long-forgotten language. Andre felt a coldness creeping over his body, paralyzing his movements. The wax figures in front of him began to change. Their faces, which had been static a moment ago, were now contorted in grimaces of horror. The eyes of the wax figures began to follow him, and their hands slowly reached out toward him, as if trying to grasp his soul. He tried to step back, but his legs felt as if they were glued to the floor. The wax figures started to move, slowly and unnaturally, like marionettes coming to life. They surrounded him, closing in tighter. Their faces now expressed fear and despair, and their eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. Suddenly, in the far corner of the room, Andre noticed a shadow distinct from the others. It was larger, darker, and seemed real. From the shadow slowly emerged a tall figure, cloaked in a long black robe. His face was hidden under a hood, but beneath it, two brightly glowing eyes, full of malice and hatred, could be seen. The figure approached closer, and Andre felt his body start to tremble with fear. The stranger raised his hand, and at that moment, the wax figures froze in place. The room fell into a deathly silence, broken only by Andre's heavy breathing. "You shouldn't have come here," the stranger said, his voice echoing through the room. "This house is a trap for souls. Those who dare to enter here are doomed to remain part of it forever." Andre wanted to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. The figure in black continued speaking, his voice penetrating Andre's mind, filling it with terror. "These wax figures were once people, just like you," the stranger continued. "They came here for different reasons, but none of them left this house. Now their souls are trapped in wax, and they will suffer in silence forever." Andre felt his mind begin to cloud. His body no longer obeyed him, and his thoughts became more and more blurred. The wax figures began to move again, but now their movements were more confident and sinister. They reached out to him as if trying to take his soul. "You will become one of them," the stranger whispered, his eyes glowing brighter. At that moment, Andre realized that his time was up. He tried to fight, to scream, but it was all in vain. It happened on a dark night when the moon shone so brightly that it seemed as if someone had lit a giant lantern in the sky. In a small town surrounded by dense forest lived a girl named Anya. She was only 10 years old, but she was already brave and curious. That night, Anya went to her friend Maxim's house to show him an old doll she had found in the woods. But on her way home, she unexpectedly lost her way. Anya didn't notice how she ended up in the cemetery that everyone in town whispered about. They said that at night, spirits roamed there, playing tricks on children and leading them into dark corners from which there was no way back. Anya had heard these stories but never believed them. But now, alone among the old, crumbling gravestones, she began to feel a cold fear creeping into her heart. She walked slowly, trying not to make any noise, but each step seemed louder than the last. It felt as though the cemetery had a life of its own. The trees whispered in the wind. A wolf howled in the distance, and on the graves, shadows seemed to move. Anya quickened her pace, but then stopped abruptly, hearing a faint cry. It came from behind a large monument covered in moss and cobwebs. Curiosity got the better of her fear, and she cautiously approached the monument. There she saw a little girl in an old-fashioned dress sitting on the ground. Her face was pale, and her eyes glistened with tears. "Why are you crying?" Anya asked timidly. The girl looked up at her. Her gaze was deep and sorrowful, like someone who had lost something important. "I can't find my way home," she whispered. "My mother told me not to wander far, but I got lost." Anya felt sorry for her. She reached out to comfort her, but as soon as her fingers touched the girl's shoulder, she disappeared, leaving behind only a light, cold breeze. Horrified, Anya stepped back, but suddenly felt someone watching her. She turned around and saw an old man in a long, worn-out coat standing by a grave. His eyes glowed with a dim light, and a chill emanated from him. "Are you looking for the way out?" he asked in a deep, echoing voice. Anya silently nodded, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. "You must find the light," he said. "Follow me." He turned and began moving through the cemetery, and Anya, too frightened to stay alone, followed him. She walked behind him, feeling the darkness closing in around her, the graves and tombstones growing taller and more ominously close. Suddenly, they stopped in front of a large crypt, its doors slightly ajar. The old man pointed at the door and said, "Go inside. There you will find what you seek." Anya, unsure of what to do, cautiously approached the door and peeked inside. There, in the darkness, she saw a small light flickering in the corner. The girl stepped inside, and the doors slowly closed behind her, leaving her in complete darkness. The light flickered, and following it, Anya found herself in the center of the room, where she saw a huge stone altar. On it lay the same doll she had brought to Maxim, but now it looked different. Its eyes were open and glowing with a terrifying red light. Suddenly, the crypt's door burst open, and Anya heard a quiet whisper behind her. Turning around, she saw the same old man, but now his eyes were empty and his face twisted into a malicious grin. "You've come here to stay," he hissed. "No one leaves this cemetery alive." Anya backed away, but suddenly felt someone grab her hand. Turning around, she saw the same girl who had been sitting by the monument. Now her face was emotionless, and her eyes were as empty as the old man's. "You'll stay with us," the girl whispered. "We're all here." Anya screamed and bolted toward the door, but icy hands held her back. In despair, she closed her eyes and screamed as loudly as she could. Suddenly, silence enveloped her, and the cold disappeared. When Anya opened her eyes, she found herself at the edge of the cemetery, where the streetlights were glowing. In the distance, she saw her home and ran toward it without looking back. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those she had met that night. Since then, Anya never walked past the cemetery and tried not to tell anyone what had happened. But sometimes, on dark nights, she would hear a quiet whisper at her window, as if someone was calling her back. Vladimir loved exploring forests, enjoying the silence and solitude that the wild expanses offered him. But on this day, everything went wrong. He decided to venture into a forest he had heard about from the locals, but that no one dared to visit. It was called the Black Forest. Legends spoke of people who entered this forest and never returned. But Vladimir was a skeptic who didn't believe in such things. He ventured deep into the forest under a blanket of mist that hovered over the ground like a silent guardian. The trees here were tall and ancient, their branches twisted like the arms of some primordial beings. The sun quickly hid behind the clouds, and soon darkness began to gather around him. The further Vladimir walked, the more he was overcome by a sense of unease. He looked around but saw nothing but shadows and dense trees, which seemed to be closing in on him. Suddenly he realized that he didn't know where he was going. The map he had brought with him was useless. The forest was much deeper than it was marked, and the trail he had been following had disappeared. Trying to find a way out, he wandered even further until he saw a dark silhouette ahead. It was an old, semi-abandoned house hidden among the trees. It looked as if it had been deserted long ago. The roof sagged, the windows were shattered, and the door hung on one hinge. But Vladimir had no other choice. Night was falling fast, and he didn't want to stay in the forest. Approaching closer, he felt a chill seep into his bones, not from the night air, but from some ominous feeling emanating from the house. He pushed the door, and it creaked open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp and mold. Vladimir shone his flashlight around. Everything was covered in dust, old and forgotten by time. The furniture stood as if someone had abruptly left the house without tidying up. Vladimir felt as though someone was watching him. He turned around, but of course there was no one there. However, the sense of unease only grew stronger. Deciding to explore the house, he walked across the creaking wooden floors. The atmosphere was eerie everywhere. Portraits on the walls stared at him with empty, faded eyes. But what caught his attention most was a room on the second floor. The door to it was locked, but as soon as Vladimir approached, the lock clicked open on its own. His heart raced, but, overcoming his fear, he entered the room. It was a bedroom. A bed in the corner was covered with old, decayed sheets. On the wall hung a mirror, and Vladimir approached it. In the reflection, he saw not only himself. Behind him stood a woman, pale and translucent, with empty eyes full of pain and horror. She raised her hand and pointed somewhere to the side. Vladimir turned around, but there was no one there. When he looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. Panic gripped him. He bolted from the room and ran down the hallway, but the door through which he had entered slammed shut by itself. Vladimir tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The floorboards under his feet began to creak louder, and footsteps echoed from the dark corridor. Someone was coming towards him. Turning around, he saw shadows moving toward him. In a panic, Vladimir noticed another door at the end of the corridor and rushed toward it. It opened easily, and he dashed outside into the house's backyard. Breathing heavily and quickly, Vladimir began to run, not knowing where he was going. He ran through the forest, trying to escape whatever was chasing him. The forest grew denser, the trees closing in as if trying to trap him. Suddenly, he felt the ground beneath him soften, and he fell into a pit. When he regained consciousness, he realized he was lying at the bottom of a deep, dark hole. Around him, he could hear whispers, as if someone was speaking right above him. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Vladimir tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were too high and slippery. Suddenly, he felt cold hands reaching out to him from the darkness. They wrapped around his legs, pulling him down into the cold abyss. The last thing he heard before he was swallowed by the impenetrable darkness was a woman's voice whispering in his ear, "You will never leave this place." Vladimir didn't remember how long he had been falling into that darkness. When he finally opened his eyes, he was surrounded by complete darkness. But this was no ordinary darkness. It was thick, dense, as if it enveloped him from all sides, depriving him of all senses. He tried to move but couldn't feel his body. It seemed as though his consciousness was floating in the void. Suddenly, he heard a familiar whisper that at first seemed distant, but gradually grew louder. It was the same woman's voice he had heard in the house. The whisper wasn't malicious, but it was filled with deep sorrow and sadness. "Why did you come here? Why didn't you heed the warnings?" the voice whispered. "Who are you?" Vladimir replied, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "I am one who was once like you, lost in this forest, found this house and became its prisoner. We are all its prisoners." The voice faded into silence, and for a moment Vladimir felt something cold touch his consciousness, as if someone was trying to penetrate his thoughts. Images began to flash before his eyes, scenes from another life. A woman in a white dress dancing in a bright room. Then the same woman standing at the threshold of the house, her face twisted in horror at the sight of something unseen. And finally, the image of the house, shrouded in darkness, consuming her. "You have to get out of here," Vladimir said, feeling his own thoughts mixing with her memories. "There is no way out," the whisper filled the space again. "This house doesn't let go. It feeds on our fears, our souls. We are doomed to remain here forever." Panic began to set in. He tried to remember how he had ended up here, but his thoughts were jumbled. Suddenly, as if awakening from a nightmare, he felt the weight of his own body. He was lying on cold ground, surrounded by darkness. But something had changed. The darkness no longer seemed so impenetrable, as if there was a faint light within it. Slowly he got up, looking around. A thin beam of light appeared before him, piercing through the fog. Vladimir felt a glimmer of hope and, following the light, began to move forward. The whisper grew quieter, as if the house's spirits were losing their hold on him. He moved slowly, afraid that the light might disappear. But as he walked, the fog around him began to dissipate, and he saw the familiar house before him. But now it looked different, more dilapidated, even more abandoned, as if it hadn't seen human presence for decades. Vladimir approached the doors, which were already half collapsed, and mustering his courage, entered once again. Everything was as he remembered, but there was a feeling of oblivion in the air, as if the house had lost its malevolent power. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, to the same room with the mirror. The mirror was cracked, but there the woman looked back at him, her gaze full of longing. She extended her hand and pointed to something. Vladimir noticed an old, decrepit amulet lying at her feet, which she seemed to want to give him. "This is the key," she whispered. "Find it in the house, and you can free us all." Vladimir reached out to the mirror, but his fingers passed through the glass. Then he turned around and began searching the house. He went through every room, checking every corner, but the amulet was nowhere to be found. In despair, he returned to the corridor where he had first seen the shadows. There, among the debris and dust, he noticed a faint glimmer. Picking up the amulet, he felt a cold energy run through his body. But with it came understanding. The amulet was ancient, and its power was tied to the house itself. Now Vladimir faced a choice: attempt to use the amulet to escape this nightmare, or try to free the souls bound to the house. He knew that this might be his last chance at salvation, but he also understood that if he didn't help the spirits, he was doomed to remain here forever, just like them. Clutching the amulet in his hand, Vladimir made his decision. In the small, nearly forgotten town of Riverville, something strange happened every autumn. The residents had long been accustomed to the quiet and peace that reigned in their corner of the world. But with the arrival of fall, everything changed. The wind grew colder, shadows on the streets lengthened, and the town was enveloped in an invisible, unsettling fear. A long-standing legend in Riverville told of a clown who appeared in the town many years ago. He worked at a traveling carnival that roamed the country, attracting children with promises of wonders and gifts. But no one knew what really lay behind his cheerful mask. This clown, known as Mr. Hee-Hee, harbored a dark secret. Since childhood, he had felt an overwhelming desire to cause pain, and over time, this desire grew into something more, into a thirst for blood. When the carnival first arrived in Riverville, no one suspected that this visit would be the last for several children. Mr. Hee-Hee would disappear at night, returning at dawn with his clothes stained in blood. He lured children into his tent, promising to show them something amazing, but instead, he plunged them into a world of horror from which no one returned. The carnival left, and Mr. Hee-Hee disappeared with it. But since then, every autumn in Riverville, children began to go missing. The legend said that Mr. Hee-Hee's spirit never left the town. Every year, with the onset of October, he returned to satiate his bloodthirsty nature once more. Years passed, and many dismissed the story as a mere tale meant to scare children. But in the fall of 2024, when Riverville was preparing for its annual Halloween celebration, strange things began to happen again. Anna and her younger brother Thomas were among those who loved scary stories. Their parents often told them about the clown, and they would laugh, calling it an old myth. But one night, when their parents went out to dinner with friends, Anna and Thomas decided to fully immerse themselves in the Halloween spirit. They pulled out an old record player and played a tape with eerie sounds, howling winds, screams, and footsteps on creaky floors. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. In the darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of their flashlights, they heard a scraping at the door. Thomas, the youngest, thought it was just the wind and went to check. But as he approached the door, something cold and sticky brushed against his hand. He jerked his hand back and stepped away. "Anna! Someone's out there!" he whispered, his voice trembling. Anna tried to turn on the lights, but nothing happened. She then pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The weak beam illuminated the dark hallway, but there was nothing there but emptiness. However, Thomas insisted that he had seen something. They returned to the living room, deciding to lock the door and wait for their parents. Time passed slowly, and every rustle outside the window made their hearts race. Suddenly, they heard a quiet laugh, a laugh that gradually grew louder, filling the house with eerie, painful joy. "Do you hear that?" Anna asked, her voice shaking with fear. Thomas nodded, his eyes wide with terror. The laughter was right behind them, though they were sure there was no one there. When Anna turned around, she saw in the mirror the reflection of someone standing behind them. It was a person in a clown costume, his face painted in a horrifying grin, but his eyes were dead, lifeless. "Mr. Hee-Hee," Thomas whispered. Anna quickly turned, but no one was there. Still, the laughter persisted. It echoed from everywhere, the walls, the floor, even the air around them. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Anna approached the door, but instead of opening it, she listened. There was silence on the other side, but the laughter continued, as if someone was just waiting for her to let them in. "Don't open it!" Thomas cried, sensing that something terrible was lurking behind that door. But the door slowly began to open on its own. In the crack between the door and the frame, a white glove appeared, then a colorful sleeve, and there stood Mr. Hee-Hee. His huge eyes stared directly at the children, his lips stretched into a terrifying grin. "Hello, children," he said in his eerie voice. "Are you ready to see a miracle?" Anna tried to close the door, but the clown was too strong. He pushed it open and stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. The laughter grew louder, more resonant, echoing from all sides. It was so piercing that it seemed the house would collapse from the sound. Anna and Thomas ran upstairs, but the clown followed them, slowly but surely. In his hands, long, sharp knives appeared, as sharp as razor blades. He took one step at a time as the children, in panic, locked themselves in their room. He's going to kill us," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking with tears. Anna didn't know what to do. On the outskirts of a small provincial town stood an old, long-abandoned house. People avoided it, whispering that something sinister lived inside. The house had a bad reputation due to mysterious disappearances that had occurred in the area many years ago. No one knew exactly what had happened, but since then the house had been shrouded in infamy. Maria, a young woman with a passion for exploring abandoned places, had long wanted to visit this house. Despite warnings from friends and local rumors, she decided it was finally time to go. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, she headed to the old building. The house looked even more ominous than she had expected, windows boarded up, the roof rotting, and weeds growing wild around it. As she entered, Maria felt a chill and an unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. But her curiosity and desire to capture everything on camera overpowered her fear. As she explored the first floor, Maria noticed a door leading to the basement. It creaked as if it hadn't been opened in years. Narrow stone steps led down, and a faint smell of mold and something else, unfamiliar and unpleasant, wafted up. Cautiously, Maria descended. The basement was filled with old, dust-covered items, but among them she saw something unusual: a doll sitting on a shelf. Its face was roughly carved from wood, and its eyes, glass empty, yet somehow filled with a strange inner life. The doll was dressed in an old, tattered dress. Maria took several photos and, unable to resist, picked up the doll. A wave of cold washed over her, as if the doll had just been taken out of a freezer. Maria decided to take the doll with her to study it later. As soon as she left the basement, she felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching her every step. But, attributing it to fatigue and tension, Maria dismissed it. That evening at home, Maria began to feel uneasy. It seemed as though her apartment had become colder than usual, and she kept hearing rustling sounds as if someone or something was moving through the rooms. The doll sat on the table, and its empty eyes seemed more alive than before. Maria tried to forget about the doll and went to bed. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by a quiet but distinct sound, as if someone had walked across the room. Maria sat up abruptly and saw something that made her blood run cold. The doll was standing on the floor, even though she clearly remembered leaving it on the table. Trembling, she got out of bed and carefully placed the doll back. The next day, Maria felt better, but still couldn't shake the feeling that her home had changed. She decided to get rid of the doll, returning it to the house and leaving it there. But when she arrived, the doll was no longer on the shelf. This shocked her to the core. In the days that followed, Maria noticed something strange. No matter where she went, the doll was always somewhere nearby. At work, on walks, even at her friends' homes. The doll even appeared at her apartment door when she returned home in the evening. Maria realized that the doll was not just an object, it was something far more sinister. In desperation, she decided to burn it, but as the flames engulfed the doll, she heard a horrifying, inhuman scream that seemed to come from everywhere. After that, the doll vanished. But every night, Maria heard its quiet laughter and rustling sounds, as if someone was walking through her apartment. Soon, Maria began to lose her mind, tormented by nightmares in which the doll stared at her with its empty eyes. One night, Maria couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a knife, she vowed to end this horror once and for all. But when she entered the room where she had left the doll, it was already waiting for her, sitting on the floor and smiling with its eerie, lifeless grin. Maria lunged at the doll with the knife, but something stopped her hand. The next morning, her friends found her. She was lying on the floor, lifeless, with the doll neatly placed on the table beside her. The doll now bore a sinister smile, and its eyes seemed filled with mockery. Since then, no one has seen Maria, and the doll was found back in that very house, on the same shelf in the basement where it always returned after every attempt to destroy it. They say it now waits for the next curious visitor who dares to take it with them. The ghost in the house on the edge of the forest. On the very edge of the forest, far from civilization, stood an old, abandoned house. Its black window frames looked like empty eye sockets of a skull, and the crooked roof loomed menacingly over the entrance, like a maw ready to devour anyone who dared to enter. The locals avoided it, whispering eerie stories about the ghost that inhabited its walls. But one day, a group of students from a nearby town, skeptical about the supernatural, decided to spend the night there to test the truth of these stories. There were 5 of them, 3 guys and 2 girls. Laughter and jokes accompanied them as they approached the house. From the outside, it seemed that there was nothing scary there, just an old ruin. But with every step closer to the door, the laughter gradually died away. Alex, the bravest of them all, was the first to enter. He pushed the heavy creaking door, and it slowly opened. Inside, there was suffocating silence, as if time had stopped in this place. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, from old furniture to crumbling walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. They slowly entered the house, lighting their way with flashlights. Every step echoed, making it feel as though someone was watching them. Strange shadows on the walls seemed alive, moving when they weren't looking. Suddenly, they heard a noise. Something had fallen in the attic. Their hearts raced, and despite their fear, they headed upstairs. The staircase creaked under their weight, each step seeming like the last. At the top, a long corridor with several closed doors awaited them. The noise came from the very last room. When they reached the door, Alex cautiously opened it. The room was empty, but the window was open and the night wind was blowing in. "It must have been the wind knocking something over," one of the guys muttered, but his voice trembled. Suddenly, the room grew colder. A girl named Lena felt cold fingers brush against her neck. She screamed and turned around, but no one was there. However, Alex, who was standing next to her, saw a red mark on her neck as if someone had really touched her. They began to realize that this place wasn't as empty as it seemed. Just as they were about to leave, the door slammed shut with a bang. The flashlight beams began to flicker and then went out completely. In total darkness, they could only hear their heavy breathing and the dull footsteps approaching them. Whatever was in that room was now with them. Suddenly, a raspy voice emerged from the darkness, uttering a single word: "Stay." The flashlights flickered back to life, and before them stood a horrifying figure, a ghost with long, twisted limbs and empty black eyes. Its face was contorted with hatred and pain, and black blood dripped from its mouth. It slowly raised its hand, pointing at Lena. She screamed, but the sound of her voice was drowned out by a sinister whisper: "You will stay with me forever." Lena felt her legs grow heavy, as if they were rooted to the floor. She couldn't move. The guys tried to pull her out of the room, but the ghost began to approach them, its terrifying gaze fixed on Lena. With each passing second, she felt the cold creeping into her heart, paralyzing her will. Understanding that something needed to be done, Alex grabbed Lena's hand and tried to pull her out of the room. The ghost howled in rage and lunged at them, but Alex managed to drag the girl into the hallway. However, as soon as they escaped the room, the door slammed shut with a loud crash, and this time the sound was like a grave marker being sealed. Once outside, they felt their strength leaving them. It was as if the cold death they had experienced inside had taken a part of their souls. They stood in silence, breathing heavily, and then ran without looking back. However, Lena, suddenly feeling relieved, realized that the cold that had gripped her in the room hadn't passed. In her mind, images of that terrifying ghost flickered, and she heard the same voice: "You cannot escape me." Days passed, and Lena's friends began to notice strange behavior in her. She became increasingly withdrawn, her eyes seemed empty, and her skin took on a pale, almost transparent hue. One night, she disappeared. Neither the police nor her friends could find her. The last person who saw Lena said she walked toward the forest, and after that, no one saw her again. A week later, unable to bear the fear and guilt, Alex decided to return to that house. He was sure he would find answers there. Approaching the house, he felt the same cold as before. Entering inside, he heard someone softly calling his name. The sound came from the attic, from that same room. Alex climbed the stairs, his heart pounding wildly. Opening the door, he saw Lena. She stood by the window, but when he came closer, horror gripped him. Lena was dead, her eyes empty, her face twisted in terror. The mist at Grave Lake. Legends about Grave Lake had been passed down from generation to generation in the small village on its shores. The elders said that the lake was doomed, cursed, and its waters harbored something terrifying. But the main focus of these tales was the mist, thick, dense, like milk, which would appear on the lake without warning and take anyone who ventured too close. One autumn evening, a group of friends decided to go camping by the lake, despite the warnings from the locals. There were 4 of them: Masha, Vika, Sergei, and Andrei. They laughed off the old stories and cautions, confident that they were just superstitions. When they reached the lake, the sun was already setting, painting the water a crimson hue. The friends set up camp on the shore, lit a fire, and started preparing dinner. The evening was quiet and peaceful, with nothing hinting at the coming danger. Vika, curious by nature, decided to go to the water's edge to fill a bottle. She approached the shore and noticed something slowly rising from the surface of the lake. Mist. It rose as if from nowhere, covering the water and rapidly moving toward the shore. The girl froze, unable to tear her eyes away from the sight. The others, noticing that Vika had been gone too long, went to check on her and saw the mist as well. But as they watched, the mist suddenly began to thicken and move faster, as if deliberately heading toward them. Vika, finally snapping out of her trance, ran back to the camp, and the others followed. But the mist was faster. Within minutes, it had engulfed the entire camp, swallowing the light from the fire and isolating the friends from each other. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps. Masha tried calling out to her friends, but her voice was swallowed up in the thick, sticky air. The mist was so dense that it seemed to envelop her, pressing down as if thousands of invisible hands were reaching for her neck. She stopped trying to get her bearings, but realized that all around her was only white haze. Suddenly, she heard footsteps ahead. Thinking it was one of her friends, she ran toward the sound, but stopped abruptly when she saw a faint silhouette barely visible in the mist. The figure was tall, twisted, as if all its bones were broken and then poorly set. Masha froze, terror piercing her to the core. The creature turned to face her, and she saw its face, if it could even be called a face. Its eyes were bottomless black pits, oozing dark liquid, and its mouth, crooked and jagged, was open as if in an eternal scream. Masha turned and ran, but the mist thickened with every step, choking her movements. Behind her, she heard the footsteps growing closer, accompanied by the creature's ragged breathing, as if it was relishing her fear. She stumbled and fell, feeling the cold hands of the mist start to wrap around her body, tightening their grip. Meanwhile, Sergei and Andrei were also wandering through the mist, but they couldn't hear Masha or each other. Suddenly, Andrei felt something cold touch his hand. He spun around sharply, but saw nothing. His heart pounded faster, and he began to panic, trying to find his way back to the campfire. Sergei, wandering in a different direction, heard a strange sound, like a moan, coming from deep within the mist. He slowly moved toward the sound, not realizing that the mist was pulling him further away from the camp. The moan grew louder, turning into a painful wail that seemed to bore into his mind. Suddenly, a creature appeared before him, distorted like a ghost. Its face was disfigured, and its hands reached out for Sergei as if to grab him. He tried to run, but his legs felt glued to the ground. The creature drew closer, its breath like icy wind cutting to the bone. At the last moment, when Sergei felt that all was lost, the mist around him abruptly cleared, and he found himself on the lake's shore, alone, without his friends, in complete silence. Masha, paralyzed with fear, felt the mist pulling her deeper until her consciousness began to fade. Visions of her friends, twisted by terror and pain, flashed before her eyes. She realized that the mist was consuming them, devouring them, leaving only empty shells behind. When the mist finally cleared, morning had come. The villagers, aware of the sinister events, went to the lake in search of the missing youths. But they found only their empty camp, the extinguished fire, and tracks leading to the water. None of the friends were ever seen again. They had become the latest victims of the mist at Grave Lake. Since then, anyone who dared approach the lake heard strange moans and saw shadows flickering on the water's surface. People said it was the souls of those who remained in the mist, forever trapped in its sinister embrace.